The sea off Point Conception does not forgive. It is a jagged knuckle of land jutting into the Pacific, a place where the cold northern currents collide with the warm waters from the south, birthing a perpetual confusion of fog and treacherous waves. Mariners call it the Cape Horn of the Pacific. It is a graveyard of ships, a place of sudden storms and phantom coastlines that appear and vanish in the mist. But on the night of October 14, 2023, the ocean was something far more unsettling than angry. It was silent. It was still. A sheet of obsidian glass stretched to a horizon that had dissolved into a starless, moonless black. Elias Thorne, alone on the deck of his trawler, the Sea Serpent, felt the quiet not as peace, but as a held breath. For a man whose life was measured by the rhythm of the waves and the cry of the gulls, this absolute stillness was a profound violation of the natural order. The diesel engine of his boat was a lone, throbbing heart in a dead world. He was 50 miles from shore, chasing the deep-water albacore, a solitary hunter on an empty plain. The fog had rolled in an hour before, not the familiar wet blanket of the California coast, but a dry, low-lying mist that coiled on the water's surface like a living thing. It glowed with a faint, internal luminescence, a phosphorescence that owed nothing to the moon or the stars, for there were none. What was this strange, glowing shroud? And why did it feel like it was watching him? Elias, a man of 58, with a face mapped by sun and sea salt, was not given to flights of fancy. He believed in the tangible, the strain of a full net, the mechanics of his engine, the predictable migration of fish. But the feeling that prickled the back of his neck was undeniable. It was a primal sense of being observed by something ancient and utterly alien. He scanned the perimeter of his vessel, the weak deck lights cutting feeble cones into the glowing haze. Nothing. Just the water, unnaturally flat, and the silence, so deep it seemed to have a physical weight. Then he saw it. Or rather, he saw the effect of it. A perfect circle of water, perhaps 300 yards off his port bow, began to behave differently. While the rest of the ocean remained a mirror, this circular patch, 100 feet in diameter, was disturbed. But it wasn't ripples from a breeze or the swell of a current. The water seemed to dome upwards, rising slowly, impossibly, as if a giant invisible sphere were pushing up from the depths. The surface tension held for a long, agonizing moment, the water glowing more intensely in that one spot before it finally broke. There was no splash. The water simply parted, peeling back like a curtain. From the black heart of the Pacific, an object descended. It rose with a serene, deliberate slowness that was both majestic and terrifying. It was a disk, a perfect metallic disk. It was vast, easily the size of a football field, its surface a dark, matte charcoal that seemed to drink the light from his boat. There were no seams, no rivets, no visible means of propulsion. As it cleared the water, not a single drop clung to its hull. The ocean sealed itself beneath it, leaving no wake, no foam, only the memory of its passage. It hovered 30 feet above the unnervingly calm sea, a silent wound in the fabric of the night. Elias Thorne was frozen, his hand gripping the steel rail of his boat so tightly his knuckles were white. His mind, a practical, orderly place, struggled to categorize the sight. It was not a submarine, it was too large, and it had emerged with impossible grace. It was not a helicopter, there were no rotors, no engine roar, only a profound and terrifying silence. The silence was the worst part. An object of that mass, displacing that much air, should have screamed with the fury of a dozen jet engines. Instead, it made no more sound than a shadow. A faint, low-frequency vibration began to thrum through the hull of the Sea Serpent, a hum he felt in the fillings of his teeth and the marrow of his bones. His rational mind fought for an explanation. A secret military craft from Vandenberg Space Force Base just up the coast? A new type of stealth drone? But the sheer scale, the impossible silence, the way it had birthed itself from the ocean, these things defied any known technology. This was something else. This was something ancient and unknown. A thought, cold and sharp, pierced through his paralysis. No one will believe this. The thought was followed by an impulse, a desperate need to validate his own senses, to capture this impossible moment. His hand released the rail, fumbling for the smartphone in his jacket pocket. The device felt clumsy and insignificant in his trembling fingers. He swiped it open, his thumb struggling to find the camera icon. The screen's light was an obscenity in the sacred, silent dark. He raised the phone, his arm shaking, and pointed it toward the colossal silent shape that dominated the sea and the sky. Through the small rectangle of his screen, the impossible became data. The lens struggled to focus, the low light creating digital noise, but the object was there. A dark, impossibly solid circle against the glowing, unnatural fog. It began to move, not with speed, but with a slow, deliberate rotation, its edge tracing a perfect, invisible circle in the air. What was this thing? A machine? A creature? Or something in between? As Elias Thorne stood on the lonely deck of his small boat, a solitary witness in the vast emptiness of the ocean, he pressed the red button. He began to record the impossible. The question that screamed in his mind was not what it was or where it had come from. The question, in that moment, was simpler and far more terrifying. What was it about to do? The digital file that began to form on his phone's memory card was more than just a video. It was a testament, a challenge to everything we think we know about the world. It was a recording of a secret that the ocean had kept for millennia, a secret that had finally, on a calm, starless night, decided to reveal itself. The man who filmed the impossible was, by every measure, an ordinary man. Elias Thorne was not a seeker of mysteries. He was a fisherman, like his father before him, and his father before him. The Thorne family had worked the waters off the central California coast for nearly a century, their lives entwined with the moods of the Pacific. Elias had been born in a small house in Lompoc, within earshot of the Vandenberg foghorns, and the sea had been his constant companion, his provider, his adversary, and, in his later years, his sanctuary. He was a man defined by routine. His days began before dawn, with the smell of diesel and coffee, and ended long after sunset, with the ache of physical labor in his bones. He knew the complex bathymetry of the Santa Barbara Channel, as well as he knew the lines on his own hands. He could read the weather in the color of the sky and the behavior of the seabirds. His world was one of practical knowledge, of cause and effect, of a deep and unsentimental respect for the power of nature. He was a widower, his wife, Maria, having been taken by cancer a decade prior. Her loss had carved a quiet hollowness into his life, a space that he filled with the vast, lonely expanse of the ocean. His 2 children were grown and gone, living lives of terrestrial predictability in cities far from the coast. He was alone, but he was not lonely. The sea was his society. His vessel, the Sea Serpent, was a 40-foot trawler, old but meticulously maintained. Every inch of it was familiar to him. The worn varnish on the wooden wheel, the particular groan of the winch under a heavy load, the constellation of rust spots on the starboard gunwale. These were the details of his existence. The boat was less a machine to him and more an extension of his own body, a hardened shell that carried him across the waters that were both his livelihood and his home. Elias was a skeptic by nature, a trait common among those whose lives depend on a realistic assessment of their environment. He had heard the stories, of course. Every fisherman along that stretch of coast had. Tales of ghost lights dancing over the waves, of strange sonar contacts that would appear from nowhere and vanish just as quickly, of vessels found adrift with their crews mysteriously absent. He'd always dismissed them as sea yarns, the product of tired minds, too much time alone, and perhaps a flask of whiskey. He believed in what he could see, touch, and explain. A strange light was a distant ship or a military flare from the nearby base. A weird sonar echo was a school of squid or a thermal layer in the water. For every mystery, there was a rational, if mundane, explanation. This deeply ingrained skepticism made him the perfect witness. He was not predisposed to seeing flying saucers in the clouds. His mind was not fertile ground for tales of the paranormal. When he saw the impossible, his first reaction was not wonder, but denial. His mind cycled through a frantic checklist of possibilities, each more inadequate than the last. An experimental blimp, a holographic projection, some bizarre atmospheric phenomenon. But the sheer physical presence of the object, the vibration that resonated through his boat, the way it displaced the very fabric of reality, these things could not be explained away. This was not a story told by another man over a beer. This was happening to him. His decision to film was not born of a desire for fame or fortune. It was the act of a man trying to tether his own sanity. The phone, an object of the modern, known world, was his anchor. The act of recording was an attempt to force the phenomenon into a framework he could understand, to reduce the sublime and terrifying spectacle into a manageable series of pixels and megabytes. He was documenting it for himself, first and foremost, proof for the morning after that he had not lost his mind. He was a man of quiet integrity, known in the small fishing community of Port San Luis as honest and dependable. He paid his bills on time, gave accurate reports of his catches, and was always willing to lend a hand to a fellow mariner in distress. His word was his bond. If Elias Thorne said he saw something, people might be skeptical of the thing he saw, but they would not be skeptical of him. This inherent credibility would become the foundation upon which the entire incredible event would later be judged. He was the ideal observer, experienced, sober, and constitutionally unimpressed by fantasy. He was a man grounded in the physical world, thrust into a confrontation with something that seemed to mock its very laws. As he stood on that deck, the cold metal of his phone in his hand, the chasm between his world of nets and tides and the world of the silent, hovering enigma before him, was absolute. He was a simple fisherman, but in that moment he became something more. He became a conduit, a bridge between the known and the unknown. The footage he was capturing was not just a video of a strange object. It was a recording of a man's entire worldview being systematically dismantled, frame by terrifying frame. And it was this man, this solid, skeptical, sea-worn man, who would carry the burden of this truth back to a world utterly unprepared to hear it. The weight of what he was seeing was immense, a pressure far greater than any deep-sea trench. It was the weight of a revelation that could change everything. The stretch of ocean where Elias Thorne had his encounter is no ordinary patch of water. It lies within a loosely defined, ominous region, sometimes referred to by researchers of the strange as the Pacific Triangle, a lesser-known cousin to the infamous Bermuda Triangle. This area, anchored by the rugged coastline of central California, the remote Farallon Islands, and the waters off Hawaii, has long been a nexus of unexplained phenomena. But its dark heart, its most active and mysterious core, is the water around Point Conception, a place where the lines between myth, military secrecy, and genuine anomaly blur into an impenetrable fog. This is not just a place of strange weather. It is a place of strange history. For centuries, the native Chumash people considered Point Conception to be the Western Gate, a sacred site where the souls of the dead departed this world for the celestial paradise. They saw it as a place of immense spiritual power, a portal between realms. Their shamans would speak of strange lights in the sky and visitors from the stars, legends that modern investigators find eerily prescient. The arrival of the modern world did nothing to dispel the region's mystique. Instead, it added a new layer of high-tech secrecy. In 1957, the United States Air Force established Vandenberg Air Force Base, which would later become Vandenberg Space Force Base, on the land directly adjoining Point Conception. This vast complex became the primary site for testing intercontinental ballistic missiles and launching military and intelligence satellites into polar orbit. The sky above these waters became a theater for the cutting edge of aerospace technology. For decades, the official narrative was that any strange light or object seen in the sky was simply a missile test, a secret aircraft, or the re-entry of space debris. This explanation became a convenient and often impenetrable shield for the authorities. It created a perfect environment for ambiguity. Was that streak of light a Minuteman missile, or was it something else, hiding in the glare of the official launch? The base itself became a source of local legends. Stories circulated among base personnel and local residents of phantom launches, where the base would go on high alert for a launch that never appeared on any official schedule. There were tales of radar operators tracking objects moving at impossible speeds, performing maneuvers that defied physics, only to have their reports classified and buried. The waters offshore became an even deeper well of mystery. This is a region of profound submarine geography, with deep canyons like the Arguello Canyon plunging thousands of feet just a few miles from the coast. These underwater trenches have long been suspected by some researchers to be ideal hiding places for unidentified submerged objects, or USOs. Sonar operators on both naval and commercial vessels have reported tracking objects moving at hundreds of knots beneath the surface, far faster than any known submarine. These contacts would often be detected in the vicinity of the Channel Islands or near the deep canyons, and they would frequently vanish as mysteriously as they appeared. The case files of civilian UFO research groups are filled with reports from this region. There is the 1964 case of the naval destroyer that allegedly tracked a massive object submerged deep in the Santa Catalina Basin, an object that paced their fleet for days before descending to a depth that would have crushed any conventional vessel. There is the 1977 incident where multiple witnesses along the coast, from Santa Barbara to Monterey, reported a colossal triangular craft that hovered silently over the ocean for hours before ascending vertically into space. There is the infamous Japan Airlines Flight 1628 incident, where the pilot, Kenju Terauchi, reported being escorted by two small unidentified craft and then shadowed by a mothership the size of two aircraft carriers over Alaskan airspace, a flight path that originates over the Pacific. These are not isolated incidents. They form a persistent, nagging pattern, a drumbeat of high strangeness emanating from this specific corner of the world. The military presence provides a convenient veil. Any inquiry is met with the predictable response: national security. All data, from radar tapes to pilot testimonies, is classified. This creates a fertile ground for conspiracy, but also for genuine frustration. If all these sightings are just secret military projects, what kind of technology are they hiding? Technology that can apparently move silently, accelerate instantaneously, and operate seamlessly between the air and the sea. If it is our own technology, it represents a leap so far beyond the public domain as to be functionally magical. If it is not ours, then the implications are even more profound. Elias Thorne, fishing in these waters, was adrift in a sea of secrets. He was a modern man navigating an ancient mystery, a place where the veil between our world and another seems to be unusually thin. The object he witnessed did not just appear from nowhere. It rose from the very heart of this legendary and enigmatic domain. It ascended from the deep, dark water, from the canyons where unknown things are said to travel. It hovered in the airspace, controlled by a military base dedicated to watching the skies. It was an intrusion, a deliberate and undeniable statement in a place already saturated with whispers and shadows. Was it a coincidence that it appeared here? Or was this region chosen? Is it a portal, as the Chumash believed? A hidden base, as USO researchers theorize? Or simply a convenient place for an unknown intelligence to operate, shielded by the constant activity of our own military? The object that Elias Thorne filmed was not just a UFO. It was a manifestation of the spirit of point conception itself, mysterious, powerful, and utterly indifferent to human comprehension. It was the latest chapter in a long, secret history, a history written in the language of strange lights, impossible speeds, and a silence that speaks louder than any engine. The phone in Elias Thorne's hand felt like a fragile talisman against an overwhelming power. The object hung in the night, a void of perfect blackness against the faintly glowing mist. Its silence was an active presence, a pressure that seemed to muffle the familiar sounds of his boat and the sea. The low, resonant hum was not a sound in the air, but a vibration in his bones, a deep cellular thrumming that felt both invasive and strangely hypnotic. He struggled to keep the camera steady, his breath fogging in the cold air, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through the small screen, he could see details that his terrified eyes had missed. The surface of the disk was not uniformly smooth. It seemed to have a subtle, complex texture, like a dark crystalline structure that shifted and flowed. It was not a solid, static surface, but something more organic, almost liquid in its constant, subtle reconfiguration. Light from his deck lamp seemed to bend and warp as it approached the craft, not reflecting off it but being drawn into it, consumed by its absolute blackness. The rotation continued, slow and inexorable. It was not the spin of a solid object. Different sections of the disk appeared to move at slightly different rates, creating a dizzying, non-Euclidean effect. It was like watching a three-dimensional object attempt to exist in a two-dimensional space, its true form impossibly complex and only partially visible to him. He felt an intense, directed sense of scrutiny. It was not a vague feeling of being watched. It was a focused, penetrating awareness. He felt as if his mind, his memories, his very biology were being scanned, analyzed, and cataloged by an intelligence that was ancient, vast, and utterly dispassionate. It was the feeling of a microbe being observed under a microscope. He was not a threat. He was not an equal. He was a specimen. A wave of vertigo washed over him, and he had to brace himself against the cabin wall. The world seemed to tilt, the horizon becoming unstable. Was it fear, or was the object itself warping the space around it? He glanced down at the boat's compass, mounted near the helm. The needle was spinning wildly, a frantic, useless blur. The GPS unit was cycling through a boot-up sequence, its screen flashing incomprehensible error messages. All his electronic navigation, his connection to the known world, had been severed. He was truly alone with this thing. The object stopped rotating. It hung motionless for what felt like an eternity. The silence deepened, the vibration in his bones intensified, building to an almost unbearable pressure. Elias had the sudden terrifying thought that his own body might simply come apart, his atoms unstrung by this invisible force. He was a man who understood pressure, the crushing weight of the deep ocean. But this was a different kind of pressure, a pressure on reality itself. From the center of the disk's underside, a change began. The dark, shifting surface seemed to thin, to become translucent. A soft, internal light grew within it, a cool, blue-white luminescence that was painful to look at, yet impossible to look away from. It was not like any light he had ever seen. It did not radiate heat. It did not cast sharp shadows. It seemed to exist in a dimension of its own, a cold fire that illuminated nothing but itself. An aperture opened, not a mechanical iris, but a seamless organic parting of the craft's surface. From this opening, a beam of energy descended. It was not a laser beam, sharp and coherent. It was a column of shimmering, semi-solid light, a waterfall of pure information. It moved slowly, deliberately, and struck the surface of the ocean. There was no steam, no boiling, no sound. Where the beam touched the water, the ocean transformed. The water within the column became perfectly, unnaturally transparent, the beam penetrating deep into the black abyss. Elias could see things in that illuminated column of water, fleeting, impossible shapes. Creatures that did not belong in the ocean, geometric structures that flashed and vanished, glimpses of a world beneath the world. The beam began to move, scanning the ocean floor like a searchlight. It was not searching for fish. The intelligence behind this was looking for something else, something specific. What could it be seeking in the crushing dark of the Arguello Canyon? A resource, a rival, another of its own kind? The beam swept closer to his boat. Elias felt a surge of pure animal terror. He wanted to run, to hide in the small cabin, but his feet were rooted to the deck. His hand, holding the phone, remained outstretched, a reflex of defiance or disbelief. He was compelled to witness this, to document it, even if it was the last thing he ever did. The column of light touched the bow of the sea serpent. There was no impact, no force, but the metal of his boat groaned, a high, keening sound of stressed molecules. The paint on the hull within the beam's circumference began to bubble and flake away, not from heat, but as if its chemical bonds were being undone. The light passed over the deck, over the neatly coiled ropes and the empty fish holds. It was a slow, methodical scan, an inventory of his small, insignificant world. He knew with a certainty that transcended logic that the beam was about to touch him. His life did not flash before his eyes. There was only the cold blue-white light, the deep thrumming in his chest, and the chilling realization that he was about to make contact with the utterly unknown. He braced himself, not for pain, but for dissolution. The column of shimmering, impossible light hesitated for a fraction of a second at the edge of his worn rubber boots, its boundary as sharp and defined as a blade. The air crackled, thick with a static charge that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. The pace of the narrative in his mind, the frantic sequence of thoughts, suddenly accelerated into a blinding percussive torrent, short, sharp, final. The beam swept over him. There was no heat, no pain, only a profound internal unraveling. For a moment that stretched into an infinite, timeless void, he was no longer Elias Thorne. He was a collection of memories, a stream of consciousness laid bare. He saw his life not as a linear progression, but as a single complex object. His first steps, the taste of salt on his lips as a child, the face of his wife Maria on their wedding day, the birth of his son, the death of his father, every fish he had ever caught, every storm he had ever weathered. All of it was present at once, a vast interconnected web of experience held up for inspection by the cold, dispassionate light. He felt the light probing his DNA, reading the genetic history of his species, a story of evolution from primordial oceans to this moment of contact. The sensation was not physical, it was informational. A colossal amount of data was being extracted, a lifetime of sensory input downloaded in an instant. Then, just as quickly, it was over. The light passed off him, sweeping over the stern of the sea serpent and back onto the water. He was left standing, gasping, his body trembling uncontrollably. The phone was still in his hand, still recording. He had not dropped it. The instinct to document had been stronger than the instinct to collapse. The beam of light, its scan complete, retracted back into the object. The aperture sealed itself, the blue-white glow faded, and the surface of the disk returned to its seamless liquid blackness. The impossible machine had what it came for. A new sound now entered the profound silence. It was a high-frequency whine, a sound at the very edge of human hearing that grew in pitch and intensity with astonishing speed. It was the sound of immense power being gathered. The disk, which had been so deliberate and slow in its movements, now demonstrated its true capabilities. It tilted at a slight 10-degree angle. And then it was gone. It did not accelerate. It did not fly away. It simply vanished. One frame of reality, it was there, a mountain of impossible metal hanging in the sky. The next frame, it was not. There was no sonic boom, no displaced air, no trail of light, just an instantaneous cessation of its existence in that location. The only evidence of its departure was a sudden, violent implosion of air rushing in to fill the vacuum it had left behind. The blast wave hit the sea serpent like a physical blow, rocking the boat violently. A rogue wave generated by the sudden displacement slapped against the hull. Elias was thrown against the cabin wall, the phone finally clattering from his grasp onto the deck. The silence that returned was different. It was no longer a held breath, it was the empty, ringing silence of a vacuum. The unnatural, glowing fog began to dissipate, not drifting away on a breeze, but dissolving, evaporating into the night air as if its power source had been switched off. Within minutes, it was gone completely. And for the first time that night, Elias Thorne saw the stars. Billions of them, cold and distant and achingly familiar. The sight of the constellations of Orion and the Pleiades was so normal, so grounding, that it almost brought him to tears. The world he knew had returned. He lay on the deck for a long time, the cold seeping into his bones, his mind a maelstrom of shock and disbelief. He had just witnessed a violation of physics. He had been scanned, catalogued, and dismissed by an intelligence beyond his comprehension. And he had filmed it. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself to his feet. His body ached, a deep, resonant ache that felt different from the usual fatigue of his work. He picked up his phone. The screen was cracked, but it was still on. The recording had stopped when it fell. The file was there. A 3-minute, 42-second video. He stared at the thumbnail, a dark shape against a grainy background. It looked so mundane, so unimpressive compared to the reality he had experienced, but it was proof. He stumbled to the helm, his movements clumsy, his coordination shot. He looked at the compass. The needle was no longer spinning. It was frozen, pointing due south, regardless of which way he turned the boat. Useless. The GPS was still dead. He looked at his watch, a simple, durable digital watch he'd had for years. The display was blank. He tapped it, but it was lifeless. He glanced at the ship's chronometer, a more robust piece of equipment. The time was 4:17 a.m. He frowned. That wasn't right. When the fog had rolled in, it had been just after 10:30 p.m. The encounter, from the object's emergence to its vanishing, had felt like no more than 15 or 20 minutes. But according to the clock, nearly 6 hours had passed. 6 hours. Gone. An entire night, compressed into a few minutes of conscious experience. The missing time was, in some ways, more terrifying than the object itself. It was an irrefutable sign that his reality, his very perception of the flow of time, had been manipulated, edited, and handed back to him incomplete. He was alone, 50 miles from shore, with no navigation but the stars he had known since childhood. For the first time in his life, Elias Thorne felt truly lost at sea. He started the engine, its familiar diesel roar a comforting sound in the immense quiet. He turned the bow of the Sea Serpent east, toward the faint promise of dawn, and began the long, slow journey back to a world that would never look the same again. The silence that followed Elias Thorne back to shore was more profound than the silence on the ocean. It was an internal quiet, the stunned aftermath of a psyche that had been overloaded. He docked the Sea Serpent at Port San Luis in the gray light of dawn, moving like an automaton. The familiar rituals of securing his boat, hosing down the deck, and greeting the few other early-rising fishermen felt alien, like scenes from someone else's life. He responded to their greetings with nods and monosyllables, his eyes distant, still seeing the impossible disk against the back of his eyelids. He went home, but his small house felt like a stranger's. He sat in his worn armchair for hours, not moving, the phone lying on the table beside him. The cracked screen was a testament. The 3-minute, 42-second file was a burden. What was he supposed to do with it? Who could he show it to? The police? The Coast Guard? They would think he was crazy or drunk. He could post it online, but it would be lost in the digital noise, dismissed as a clever fake, a CGI hoax. He felt an immense, crushing isolation. He was the sole keeper of a reality-shattering secret. For 2 days, he did nothing. He didn't eat. He barely slept. He would play the video, watch the dark shape rotate, see the column of light descend, and his hand would start to shake all over again. The video was both a confirmation and a curse. It proved he wasn't insane, but it also proved that the world was not the safe, predictable place he had believed it to be. The physical effects of the encounter lingered. He had a persistent, low-grade headache. His ears rang with a faint, high-pitched tone, the ghost of the sound the object had made before vanishing. And there was the time. The missing 6 hours were a black hole in his memory, a source of constant, gnawing anxiety. What had happened in that lost time? Had the scan he remembered been the only thing? Or was that just the part he was allowed to remember? On the 3rd day, driven by a desperate need for validation, he made a call. Not to the authorities, but to his nephew, a tech-savvy college student in San Diego. He sent the file with a simple, understated message. "Saw something strange out on the water? What do you make of this?" The nephew's reaction was immediate and explosive. He called back within minutes, his voice a torrent of excited questions. He wasn't skeptical. He was convinced. He saw the subtle details that marked it as authentic, the camera shake that matched the boat's motion, the way the object's light didn't properly reflect on the water, the lack of any CGI artifacts under digital analysis. Against Elias's wishes, the nephew, convinced he was sitting on the most important footage in human history, posted it to a small, niche forum dedicated to the serious analysis of UAP phenomena. The forum was frequented by a handful of dedicated, obsessive researchers. It was a place where evidence was scrutinized with a rigor that bordered on paranoia. Within hours, the video, dubbed the Fisherman's footage, was a sensation within that small community. It was copied, mirrored, and analyzed. Debates raged. Frame-by-frame breakdowns were posted. The metadata was examined. It was here, in this digital ecosystem of believers and obsessive skeptics, that the footage came to the attention of one Dr. Aris Thorne. The name was a coincidence, a strange cosmic rhyme that she would later find grimly amusing. Dr. Thorne was not a typical UFO hunter. She was a figure of quiet intellectual tragedy. Once a promising astrophysicist with a brilliant career ahead of her at Caltech, she had committed the ultimate academic sin. She had taken unidentified aerial phenomena seriously. Her fascination began not with lights in the sky, but with data. While analyzing telemetry from deep space probes, she stumbled upon anomalous signals, brief, structured bursts of energy that defied any natural explanation. Her attempts to study them were met with resistance, then ridicule from her colleagues. They called it instrument error or statistical noise. But she saw a pattern. She began to discreetly collect other such data points: declassified pilot reports, strange radar returns, sonar tracks of impossibly fast submerged objects. Her obsession grew while her academic standing withered. She was eventually denied tenure, her career effectively over. She was ostracized, a brilliant mind cast out for looking at the things she was not supposed to look at. Undeterred, she used her small inheritance to found the Ethelred Institute for Anomalous Research, a grand name for a two-room office above a laundromat in Pasadena. With a handful of volunteers and aging equipment, she continued her work in obscurity. She was the quintessential investigator, driven not by a desire for belief, but by an unyielding demand for evidence. She had seen 1,000 fake videos, 100 misidentified weather balloons. She was jaded, cynical, and incredibly difficult to impress. When she first saw the Fisherman's footage, her initial reaction was dismissal. Another grainy, low-light video, but then she watched it again, and again. She saw what the others had seen: the lack of identifiable propulsion, the impossible silence implied by the ambient audio. But she also saw more. She saw the way the water domed up as the object emerged, a fluid dynamic that suggested a massive displacement field rather than simple buoyancy. She saw the subtle warping of the background stars at the edge of the craft, a telltale sign of gravitational lensing, however localized. She saw the spectral quality of the light beam, which, even on the compressed video, showed a strange banded pattern that was inconsistent with any known light source. This was different. This was real. This was the data point she had been waiting for her entire life. She used her network of contacts, a motley collection of hackers, ex-military whistleblowers, and fellow researchers, to trace the video's origin. It took her less than a day to find the nephew, and from him to get the name and location of the source, a fisherman named Elias Thorne. She packed a bag, loaded her car with sensitive analysis equipment, and began the drive north, up the coast, toward a man who held a piece of the puzzle she had dedicated her life to solving. She was not just going to see a witness, she was going to the source of a signal that could change the world, a signal that she, and perhaps only she, was equipped to understand. The meeting between the witness and the investigator was not a dramatic confrontation. It was a quiet convergence of two solitary worlds. Aris Thorne found Elias Thorne not at his home, but on his boat, the Sea Serpent, where he was methodically mending a net. He moved with a distracted slowness, his hands performing the familiar task while his mind was clearly 100 miles away, lost in the dark waters off Point Conception. Aris approached him not with the breathless excitement of a UFO enthusiast, but with the calm, measured demeanor of a scientist. She introduced herself simply, explaining that she studied unusual atmospheric and oceanic phenomena. She did not use the word UFO. She did not mention aliens. She spoke of data, of analysis, of wanting to understand what he had recorded. Elias was wary. He had already been hounded by calls from sensationalist YouTubers and wild-eyed conspiracy theorists who had tracked him down. But Aris was different. There was a seriousness in her eyes, a deep, weary intelligence that he recognized. She was not looking for a story. She was looking for the truth. He saw in her a fellow traveler in isolation, a person who had also seen something that set her apart from the rest of the world. He agreed to talk. For hours they sat in the small, cramped cabin of the sea serpent, the smell of brine and diesel hanging in the air. Elias spoke, his voice low and steady, recounting the events of that night. He left nothing out. The unnatural stillness of the water, the glowing fog, the impossible emergence of the disk, the feeling of being scanned, the beam of light, the instantaneous departure, the missing time. Aris listened without interruption, her gaze intent. She did not judge. She did not doubt. She only absorbed. When he was finished, a profound silence filled the cabin. Elias felt a sense of relief, the unburdening of a weight he had been carrying alone. Finally, someone understood the gravity of what he had witnessed. Aris then began her work. With Elias's permission, she turned the sea serpent into a floating laboratory. She was meticulous, her process a stark contrast to the chaotic nature of the event she was investigating. She took paint scrapings from the bow where the beam of light had touched it. She used a specialized Geiger counter to scan the entire vessel for residual radiation. The readings were strangely normal, except for a bizarre, localized spike of alpha particle emission on the deck where Elias had been standing, a type of radiation that should not have been there. She took samples of the metal from the ship's compass, which was still frozen, its internal magnetic components seemingly scrambled at a molecular level. She spent hours with Elias's phone, carefully transferring the original uncompressed video file to a hardened laptop. She analyzed the video's metadata, the digital fingerprint embedded in the file. It confirmed the time, date, and GPS coordinates of the recording, at least up to the point where the boat's electronics had failed. The GPS data showed the sea serpent stationary at a point directly above the deep Arguello Canyon. Back, in her makeshift lab in Pasadena, the analysis deepened. The results that came back were more astounding than she could have imagined. The paint scrapings, when examined under an electron microscope, showed that the polymer chains had been systematically deconstructed, not burned or melted, but unmade. It was a process that would require immense energy, applied with surgical precision. The trace residues found on the deck were even more baffling. Mass spectrometry revealed isotopes of certain rare earth elements, like ytterbium and promethium, but in a ratio that does not occur in nature. They were stable isotopes of elements that should have been radioactive, a physical impossibility according to our current understanding of nuclear physics. But the crown jewel of the investigation was the video file itself. Aris ran a frame-by-frame spectral analysis of the beam of light. The spectrum was not continuous like sunlight, nor was it a series of sharp peaks like a laser. It was a complex structured signal, a series of data-rich bands that looked more like a barcode than a light source. She theorized that it wasn't a beam of light in the conventional sense, but a carrier wave for a massive amount of information. It was a read-write tool of unimaginable complexity. She analyzed the object's departure. The instantaneous vanishing occurred between two frames of the video, a time gap of 1/30th of a second. There was no blur, no distortion, nothing. To disappear from that point in space, an object of that estimated mass would have had to accelerate to near-light speed almost instantaneously, an act that would have released enough energy to vaporize the sea serpent and boil the surrounding ocean. Yet, there was only the implosion of air. This suggested a technology that did not involve propulsion through space, but rather the manipulation of space-time itself. It didn't travel, it simply relocated, punching a hole from one point to another. Aris Thorne, the disgraced scientist, the pariah of the academic community, now held in her hands the most significant scientific data in human history. She had physical evidence of impossible isotopes, forensic proof of molecular deconstruction, and digital proof of a technology that treated the laws of physics as mere suggestions. She had the testimony of a credible, unshakable witness. She had it all. The question was what to do with it. Publishing in a mainstream scientific journal was impossible. She would be laughed out of the room before she even presented her findings. Her evidence was too extraordinary, her subject too taboo. She knew that releasing this information would not bring her vindication, it would bring a storm. But she also knew that the truth she held was not hers to keep. It belonged to the world, whether the world was ready for it or not. She compiled her data, her analyses, her conclusions into a comprehensive report, backing it up with Elias Thorne's full, unedited testimony and the pristine original video file. She prepared to open the door and shout into the hurricane. The leak was not a flood, but a single, well-placed drop of ink in a vast ocean of information. Iris Thorne did not release her findings to the tabloids or sensationalist websites. She sent her complete 200-page report, including all raw data and the original video file, to a select group of trusted colleagues, a handful of tenured professors at various universities who she knew harbored a private interest in the phenomenon, a few respected journalists in the national security space, and a retired admiral with whom she had a quiet, long-standing correspondence. It was a calculated risk. She hoped that by providing the unassailable data to credible, sober-minded individuals, the information would be treated with the seriousness it deserved. For 48 hours, there was silence. Then, the storm broke. The first article appeared not on a fringe blog, but on the website of a major respected news organization, written by a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist known for his deep sources within the Pentagon. The article was cautious, framed as a question. It detailed the claims of a highly credible witness and the startling analysis by a former Caltech astrophysicist. It included a short, heavily watermarked clip of the footage. That was all it took. The internet ignited. The Fisherman's footage and the Point Conception incident became global trending topics. The video, now legitimized by a mainstream source, was everywhere. It was dissected on cable news, debated on podcasts, and replayed endlessly on social media. The public reaction was a mixture of awe, fear, and rabid skepticism. For many, it was the smoking gun they had always been waiting for. For others, it was simply the most sophisticated hoax ever perpetrated. And then, the authority began to stir. The first response was unofficial. Anonymous sources within the Department of Defense began whispering to their favored reporters. They suggested the object was a new type of lighter-than-air surveillance craft being tested out of Vandenberg, a classified program. They claimed the beam of light was a novel, non-lethal deterrent system designed to disable boat engines, and that the fishermen had simply panicked. The story was plausible enough to sow doubt, but it didn't explain the object's emergence from the ocean, its impossible speed, or Iris Thorne's physical evidence. The official response came 3 days later. It was a joint statement from a newly formed entity, the Maritime Domain Awareness and Anomaly Resolution Office, MANDARO, a bland bureaucratic name that reeked of obfuscation. The statement was a masterpiece of misdirection. It claimed the event was a combination of several distinct and unrelated phenomena. The object, they stated, was an experimental high-altitude weather balloon equipped with reflective material which had descended due to a malfunction. Its appearance was distorted by a complex temperature inversion and the fisherman's oblique viewing angle. The beam of light was explained away as a transient luminous event, a form of upper atmospheric lightning coincidentally occurring in the same location. The missing time was attributed to a faulty chronometer and the psychological stress of the witness. The physical evidence collected by Dr. Thorne was dismissed as unverifiable and likely contaminated. It was a neat, tidy explanation that accounted for everything while explaining nothing. It was designed to calm the public and shut down the story. For the general populace, it largely worked. The news cycle moved on. But for those who had looked closely, the official explanation was more damning than the footage itself. It was too convenient, too dismissive, too insulting to the intelligence of anyone who had examined the case. Iris Thorne immediately published a rebuttal, systematically dismantling the MDARO's claims. A weather balloon cannot emerge from the ocean. It cannot hover against the wind. It cannot have a localized gravitational effect. A lightning event cannot deconstruct polymer chains or leave behind impossible isotopes. The official story was, from a scientific standpoint, more fantastical than the truth. The counter-reaction from the authority was swift and silent. The pressure began. Elias Thorne, who had tried to remain anonymous, was suddenly a person of interest. 2 men in dark conservative suits paid him a visit. They didn't identify themselves as FBI or any other known agency. They were from a liaison office. They were polite, but their questions were pointed. They suggested his memory might be unreliable. They hinted that his fishing licenses could come under review for safety violations. They strongly advised him against any further interviews for his own peace of mind. It was a velvet-gloved threat, and Elias understood it perfectly. At the same time, Eris Thorne found herself under attack. An anonymous, well-funded online campaign began to discredit her. Her past academic disputes were dredged up and twisted. She was portrayed as a disgruntled, pseudo-scientific crank. Her institute's funding, already precarious, dried up overnight as donors were spooked. Her website was hit with a sophisticated denial-of-service attack, wiping her report from her own server. The original footage, which had been uploaded to major video platforms, began to disappear, flagged for copyright violations by a mysterious, newly created corporate entity. The authority was not just denying the event, it was actively trying to erase it from existence. They were scrubbing the digital reality, creating their own, sanitized version of history. This aggressive, coordinated cover-up was, for many researchers, the ultimate confirmation. Why go to such lengths to debunk a simple weather balloon? Why harass an old fisherman and a struggling scientist? The ferocity of the denial was proportional to the significance of the truth they were trying to hide. The message was clear. You did not see what you saw, and if you continue to say you did, there will be consequences. The cover-up transformed the Point Conception incident from a simple UFO sighting into a full-blown conspiracy, a battle between a small group of truth-tellers and a vast, shadowy apparatus of power. The aftermath settled like a fine layer of dust over the lives of those who had touched the truth. The world, for the most part, moved on. The Point Conception incident became another piece of modern folklore, a celebrated case file for a dedicated minority, but a fading headline for the majority. The official explanation, however flimsy, had provided a comfortable off-ramp for those who did not wish to confront the unsettling implications of the event. A weather balloon, a lightning strike, a stressed fisherman. These were digestible concepts, easily filed away. The alternative, that a vast unknown intelligence was operating with impunity in our skies and oceans, was a truth too heavy for the fragile architecture of modern life. Elias Thorne retreated into the silence from which he had emerged. He sold the sea serpent. The sea, once his sanctuary, was now haunted by the memory of the silent disk and the missing hours. He could no longer find peace in its vastness, only the echo of a terrifying cosmic indifference. He moved to a small town in a landlocked state, seeking the anonymity of the plains, a place where the sky was just a sky, and the deepest mystery was the changing of the seasons. He never spoke of the incident again, but the knowledge of it remained etched into his soul. He was a man out of time, a man who had glimpsed the true, bewildering scale of the universe and could no longer pretend to be at home in the smallness of the world. He was the witness, forever changed, his testimony living on in a digital file while he himself faded into obscurity. Dr. Eris Thorne, however, did not fade. The attacks against her had the opposite of their intended effect. They hardened her resolve. She became a central figure in the subculture of UAP research, a reluctant leader for a community of seekers. Stripped of her institute and her funding, she went underground, operating from a network of secure servers and communicating through encrypted channels. She became a curator of forbidden knowledge. Her original report, scrubbed from the mainstream internet, became a prized possession shared on the dark web and among trusted circles. She continued to gather data, to connect the dots between the Point Conception incident and other similar events around the world. She saw the pattern, the proximity to deep water and military installations, the impossible physics, the silent operation, the apparent interest in both the planet's geology and the biology of its inhabitants, and the aggressive, systematic denial by global authorities. She was no longer just a scientist analyzing a data point. She had become an archivist of a secret war, a quiet conflict being waged in our blind spots by forces we refuse to acknowledge. The authority, the faceless MDRO, had won the public relations battle but had lost the war for the truth. Their heavy-handed cover-up had created a Streisand effect, making the original evidence more sought after, more precious. The few pristine copies of the Fisherman's footage that survived the digital purge were treated like sacred texts. They were analyzed by independent researchers, AI experts, and visual effects artists around the globe, all of whom came to the same conclusion: the footage was authentic. The object it depicted was real. And so the case remains. A paradox of certainty and mystery. The evidence is undeniable, yet officially denied. The witness is credible, yet officially dismissed. The implications are world-changing, yet the world continues to turn as if nothing has happened. We are left with the questions, the same questions that echoed in the silent aftermath of the encounter, questions that now resonate with a conspiratorial hum. What did Elias Thorne truly capture on that lonely stretch of ocean? Was it a vehicle from another star system, a probe from a distant civilization on a mission of reconnaissance? Or was it something closer to home? Could it be a traveler from another dimension, bleeding through into our own reality at a place where the barriers are thin? Or does the answer lie not in the stars, but in the crushing dark of our own oceans, a domain less explored than the surface of the moon? Could we be sharing our planet with a native, non-human intelligence, an ancient civilization that has remained hidden in the depths, a civilization for whom we are the curious, transient surface dwellers? The object's behavior suggests an intelligence that is scientific, analytical, and perhaps even biological in its focus. It scanned the seabed. It analyzed the materials of a human vessel. It downloaded the life experience of a human being. Why? Was it simple curiosity? A threat assessment? Or was it something more profound, a cataloging of a world it perceives as fragile or perhaps as a resource? And what of the authority? Why the desperate cover-up? Are they trying to prevent mass panic as they might claim? Or are they hiding their own impotence, the terrifying truth that they have no control over our planet's airspace and oceans? Or is the secret even darker? Is there a dialogue, a treaty, an agreement with this unknown intelligence that we, the public, are not privy to? Are they hiding this one incident because it is part of a much larger, ongoing interaction? The story of Elias Thorne and the metallic disc over the Pacific is not just a story about a UFO. It is a story about the limits of our perception, the fragility of our consensus reality, and the power of a single undeniable observation to challenge everything we know. The file remains open. The footage is still out there, a ghost in the machine, waiting for a time when we are ready to look at it, not as a curiosity or a threat, but as a revelation. Until then, we are left to wonder. What else is lurking in the deep, silent places of our world? And when will the next one decide to rise from the water?